China just co-signed America's two core red lines on Iran in the same room as Donald Trump, not through back-channel diplomatic signaling, not through carefully worded foreign ministry statements designed to preserve strategic ambiguity. In the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, on the record, in the first bilateral session of the Trump-Xi summit, China officially agreed that Iran cannot possess a nuclear weapon and that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to international commerce. I'm going to tell you exactly what that means for the IRGC's war chest, why Beijing's position change is more devastating to Iran's endurance capacity than any military strike the American force posture has executed, what the energy mathematics look like when the world's largest single crude oil buyer begins substituting away from Iranian supply, and why the IRGC's response, launching a military exercise called Martyr Commander within hours of the summit's first session, tells you more about the organization's internal state than any weapons inventory count could. Stay with me, because what happened in Beijing on May 14th changes the diplomatic battlefield of this conflict more fundamentally than anything that has occurred since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. Let me be precise about what China's position actually was before this summit and what it has now become, because the distance between those 2 points is the measure of how much the strategic landscape shifted in a single bilateral session. For the duration of this conflict, Beijing has been the economic oxygen supply keeping the Islamic Republic's war machine functioning. China purchases approximately 1.6 million barrels of Iranian crude every single day, roughly 1 in every 7 barrels China consumes, at a discount estimated at $8 to $10 per barrel below Brent pricing. That discount arrangement exists because Iran has no alternative buyer capable of absorbing that volume and no other major customer willing to accept the secondary sanctions exposure that purchasing Iranian crude requires. Iran cannot walk away from China. The leverage runs entirely in one direction. China has simultaneously been providing diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, reflexively blocking alongside Russia any international consensus that would translate Iranian maritime conduct into binding multilateral accountability. That combination, discounted oil purchases plus diplomatic blocking, has been the mechanism through which the IRGC converted trapped oil into operational cash while insulating itself from the institutional consequences of what it has been doing in the Strait. In the Great Hall of the People on May 14th, Xi Jinping sat down with the American president and publicly withdrew from both sides of that arrangement simultaneously. No nuclear weapon. Strait must reopen. That is not a subtle diplomatic repositioning. That is Beijing stepping out of the room where it has been standing between Iran and the full weight of American economic and military pressure. And the consequences of that exit, when they fully land in the financial models that Vahidi's command structure is running for its endurance calculation, are more structurally damaging to the IRGC's position than any airstrike this conflict has produced. The energy mathematics are where China's leverage actually lives and where the IRGC's vulnerability is most precisely quantifiable. China imports 11.6 million barrels of crude per day, a record high. Iran supplies 1.6 million of those barrels at deep discount pricing that reflects the supplier's complete absence of negotiating leverage. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, Russia, and the United States together have the collective capacity to absorb most of the Iranian volume that China currently sources over a 6 to 12-month substitution timeline. Saudi Arabia alone, with Aramco at elevated production levels and the East-West pipeline operational, holds significant spare capacity that it has been holding back pending market normalization. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline is already moving 1.5 million barrels per day entirely outside Iranian interdiction range. China's strategic petroleum reserve sits at approximately 1.4 billion barrels, roughly 4 months of total import coverage, providing the buffer that allows Beijing to begin the substitution process without facing its own energy security crisis during the transition. What was missing until May 14th was the political will to deploy the leverage that the mathematics have always described. That political will is now on the record in the same room as the American president. And the moment Chinese oil procurement managers and state-owned enterprise purchasing directors begin operationalizing the directional signal that a bilateral presidential agreement represents, Iranian oil revenue projections start revising downward in ways that compound against the $500 million daily blockade loss that is already eroding the IRGC's financial foundation. The CIA's 3 to 4 month endurance window was calculated against the existing financial trajectory. China's position change compresses that timeline by a margin that Vahidi's accountants will feel within weeks. But if you think the energy mathematics are the most consequential dimension of what Beijing just did to Iran's strategic position, stay with me, because the 3 specific levers China now holds, and the sequence in which they can be deployed, is where the full depth of the pressure that just arrived becomes clear. The first lever is the direct reduction of Iranian crude purchases. The 600,000 barrels per day of American crude committed in the summit's first session is the opening movement of a substitution process that, if completed, removes the primary revenue channel sustaining the IRGC's operational cash flow. This does not happen overnight. Import infrastructure, refinery configurations, existing purchase contracts, and shipping logistics all create inertia against rapid change. But the directional signal is now public, bilateral, and on the presidential record, which means it is not a signal that Chinese purchasing managers can treat as ambiguous guidance subject to their own interpretation. The trajectory is established. Every barrel China shifts from Iranian to American or Gulf supply is a barrel that does not reach Vahedi's war chest. Multiplied across the substitution timeline against the existing blockade losses, the financial compression arrives with a severity that no IRGC military exercise can address. The second lever is the withdrawal of China's diplomatic cover at international forums. For the duration of this conflict, Beijing's Reflexive Security Council blocking alongside Russia has been the mechanism preventing unified international accountability from producing binding pressure on Iranian maritime conduct. Xi's public statement opposing Iranian toll charging and the militarization of the strait is the beginning of the erosion of that blocking posture. When China stops reflexively shielding Iranian conduct at the Security Council, the international legal environment around every IRGC operational move in the strait changes. Ships from nations previously deterred from challenging Iranian toll demands by the absence of unified international backing now have the standing to transit with Security Council support. This lever does not require Beijing to do anything active. It requires Beijing to stop doing something it has been doing reflexively. And the cessation of reflexive cover, once established as the default position, aligns with China's actual commercial interests in an open strait rather than against them, making it far more durable than active support would be. The third lever is the one that would rewrite the operational architecture of strait security entirely. A People's Liberation Army Navy escort of Chinese flag convoys through the Strait of Hormuz would simultaneously signal Beijing's refusal to pay Iranian transit tolls, its rejection of a U.S.-only security framework in the waterway, and its assertion of independent naval presence in a theater the American blockade has been administering as an exclusive operational zone. This is not a hostile act toward Washington in the context of a summit that produced bilateral agreement on the strait's reopening. It is joint enforcement of the agreed position conducted through Chinese naval assets. The seismic option is less probable in the immediate term than levers 1 and 2. But the fact that the summit produced public agreement on the strait before the question of who enforces that agreement was resolved means lever 3 now has a diplomatic foundation that did not exist 48 hours ago. And what happens next inside the IRGC's command structure in response to all of this is where the strategic picture connects to the specific institutional logic that makes Vahedi's organization simultaneously the most dangerous actor in this theater and the most structurally exposed to the pressure that Beijing's repositioning introduces. The IRGC's survival strategy requires the war to continue. This is not a preference. It is an institutional necessity. War justifies IRGC dominance of Iranian governance. War provides the constitutional framework within which the organization's control of 40% of Iran's domestic economy, its telecommunications infrastructure, its port operations, its banking relationships, and its internal suppression apparatus is defensible. Peacetime accountability is the IRGC's existential threat. Not American airstrikes, not the blockade, not the financial attrition. The question that a negotiated peace asks of the IRGC is the question the institution cannot answer in a post-war environment. Why does a military organization control the national economy when there is no war to justify it? Vahedi understands this with complete clarity. His entire strategic calculation is oriented around keeping the conflict narrative alive long enough for the pressure on Washington to produce accommodation on terms that leave the IRGC's domestic power structure intact. China just made that calculation significantly more expensive to execute by publicly endorsing the 2 American red lines that the strategy depends on preventing from being enforced. The Martyr Commander exercise is Vahedi's response to that development, and the name of the exercise tells you everything about who the message is actually directed at. Stay with me, because the naming logic of military exercises reveals more about an organization's internal state than its published order of battle does. Military organizations name their exercises for operational objectives when they are confident and focused outward toward the adversary. They name their exercises for martyred commanders when they are focused inward on their own institutional legitimacy and the loyalty of their own personnel. Martyr Commander communicates nothing to the United States Navy about IRGC tactical doctrine, weapons employment, or escalation thresholds. It communicates to the IRGC's own soldiers, officers, and regional commanders that the current leadership stands in the tradition of revolutionary sacrifice and that continuing to fight under current conditions carries the same institutional legitimacy as the Iran-Iraq War, the proxy campaigns across Lebanon and Yemen, and every operation that produced the martyred commanders the exercise name invokes. This is loyalty reinforcement messaging. It is the kind of institutional communication an organization produces when its internal cohesion is under stress from forces that parallel its external difficulties. Economic strangulation reduces salaries. Battlefield defeats reduce morale. Fahidi's internal power consolidation, blocking presidential cabinet appointments, deploying loyalists to monitor the foreign minister's diplomatic contacts, declaring direct IRGC management of all critical positions under wartime conditions, reduces institutional trust across the factions, losing influence to his centralization. All three stress vectors are operating simultaneously inside the IRGC right now. Martyr Commander is the command's response to all three at once. It is not a military threat to the coalition. It is a loyalty performance for an institution whose internal solidarity cannot be assumed under current conditions, and Beijing just made those current conditions considerably more difficult to sustain.